The objective of this YouTube is to help guide you through some more of the knowledge. What we want to do is apply some scenarios for the rules of evidence and principles of assessment. So before you're answering the questions below, I'm just going to work through each scenario with you to help guide you in your answer selection. Now, it's best to have your prompt sheet in front of you. So the orange side again is the rules of evidence, and on the left in the green is the principles of assessment. So have that open and ready when you're going to be answering those questions. So in the first question, it's giving you a scenario where the assessor looks over the mapped assessment methods to consider the evidence as a whole. Okay, so he's actually looking perhaps in your unit of competency where the RTO has provided the mapping directly there. So he's checking that you've got a range of assessment methods, okay? Now, the assessor's ensuring that at least one direct form of evidence is provided. So remember, the strongest evidence is the direct observations, okay? And you can either directly observe them in a task and use the instrument, which is the observation checklist, or you can directly observe the work product that they've produced and submitted to you. Okay, and that is a strong form of evidence because it's direct observation. So which rule of evidence is applied by using this policy or this procedure? So the fact that the assessor is going and checking that the mapping has ensured that there's a strong piece of evidence there. Okay, a direct observation as at least one. So at least one is the key here. There's got to be more than just one piece of evidence, and within the range of that evidence it has to be a strong piece. So does that relate if you are looking at the orange section here, which is the rules of evidence? Oh, what's going on there? I'm sorry about that. So is that in relation to valid? Does the evidence address what it claims to address? Is it about authenticity? Can the candidate show that it's their own work? I don't think it really relates to that if they're looking at the mapping. Is it current in terms of industry practice? Well, it doesn't really. If the assessor's looking at the mapping, it's not related to that. So let's see. Is there enough evidence to meet the requirements? Okay, this is about the range of evidence. So sufficiency is what that policy is all about. Okay, so if you want to go back, you can see that you are given in your YouTube document those options. So the fact that you're looking at the mapping is in relation to meeting the rules of evidence about that there is sufficient evidence. Okay? So I would probably pause this now and go and highlight your selected answer for that question. Moving on now, the second question in this set, the candidate is e-learning. So the context is that they're not in a workplace environment, they're probably e-learning from home or some other mobile location. Okay? The assessor ensures that the product is the candidate's own work by webcasting or teleconferencing. This allows the candidate to demonstrate their relationship to the product. So which rule of evidence is applied now? Because they're e-learning, we need to make sure it's their own evidence. So we go back here, valid. Does it address what it claims to address within the requirements of the unit? No, it's not really about that, is it? Current, it's not about industry currency. It's not about that mapping and the range of evidence. So it is in fact about the rules of evidence with it being authentic, that it is the candidate's own work. So this is how we're actually applying this prompt sheet to the scenarios. Now you might be right, you may not need this YouTube. You might be right now just to keep applying your prompt sheet through the questions and working it out. Now this is the next scenario. The product does not address the performance criterion it claims to address. what do? Do you provide feedback of what you're looking for and ask the client if they feel the product adequately meets the requirement? Do you give the client an opportunity to resubmit other evidence? Do you perhaps discard the evidence altogether and assess other sufficient evidence provided? Well, actually, you could do all three or any combination of it, because this is all about validity. We're making sure that it meets the requirements of the unit. And if they've provided an irrelevant piece of evidence, it's just not something that you can use. It doesn't matter how satisfactorily produced the piece is. If it's not directly related to the performance criterion at hand, you've got to discard it. But you can't just discard it and say, oh, you're not competent. You would then have to go back and negotiate with the client as well. So you'd give them that feedback. You would have to say, look, unfortunately, the requirements of this unit is that blah, 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 and you actually state whatever the performance criterion is. Unfortunately, the product that you've supplied isn't able to demonstrate that. Is there any other evidence that you could submit, any other relevant pieces that could meet that element or that task? So you've actually got to do all three, including the fact that you're discarding that particular piece of evidence. Okay? On to the next one. Susan's sight impairment requires the written questions font to be enlarged, which is a reasonable form of adjustment. This adjustment also maintains the integrity of the unit, since she has no advantage over the other candidates. So it's not like we've provided her with a scribe or somebody who's going to translate anything for her, where there might be a risk run of that translator answering the questions on her behalf and giving her an advantage. And you still can use a translator. I'm just saying that there's no risk now, because all we're doing is giving her the exact same piece of assessment, just in electronic form, so she can enlarge it. Okay, so the integrity is maintained. So which two principles of assessment have been considered? So now we're on the left-hand side, the principles of assessment. We have another validity focus here, the requirements of the unit, the AQF level, current industry practice, and you can see some correlation between valid and current rules of evidence there. But no, it's not really anything to do with that. Reliability, well, we know that is making sure that any of the benchmarking, here at a vote where we do the red text as a benchmark to show what a satisfactory response is. Reliability is all about whatever that benchmarking is, that it could consistently be judged by any assessor stepping in. Okay? It's also reliability is that the candidate could reliably reproduce the task at any given time. So it'd have to be more than one event. But no, it doesn't really have anything to do with reliability either. So therefore, let's go and look at flexibility and fairness, because the question asked which two principles of assessment. So there's alternatives. We're flexible. So yes, rather than giving her a hard copy, we can be flexible. There's an alternative, reasonable adjustment that can be made, and it maintains the integrity of the unit, so it's fair to all other candidates, that she hasn't got an unfair advantage over them. So this would be the answer: flexibility and fairness. Now, finally, one final scenario. Susan's teacher's registration has expired. Okay. Her resume states she last taught 15 years ago. Upon questioning, she confirms that she's not made any type of presentation since then. So really, she's been a retired teacher for 15 years. She may have not been retired in her life. She might have done some other job, but she hasn't been doing teaching, training, any types of presentation for 15 years. Nor has she maintained her teacher's registration, which would require ongoing professional development to keep up to date with the latest pedagogy theories. Okay, so nothing for 15 years. As an expert in training and assessment, you are aware of industry standards in use of technology and presentation, and a modern day emphasis on inclusive practice. So these have been the big buzzwords in the last 5 to 10 years. You know, IT, you know, some people have got their pedagogical license, you know, with IT there. You know, it's all about differentiation and inclusive practice these days. Well, Susan's not going to have been exposed to any of this. She's not going to have modern use of data projectors and PowerPoint presentations if she hasn't been teaching for 15 years. So let's keep that in mind. During the competency conversation, that's the conversation that you're having during a recognised prior learning module, Susan explains she would use an overhead projector and photocopy transparencies, which is reflective of 15 to 20 years ago. Her definition of equity, so when you've asked her in that competency conversation about Susan, what's equity? How would you explain inclusive practice? Because in a competency conversation, you're trying to see if she's got the knowledge, if we can close those gaps anyway. But the way Susan's defined equity is all students are given the same form of assessment. That's what equity is to her. All students are given the same form of assessment. And no, there's no adjustments. Equity is about equal for all people. Now, your judgment is that Susan's evidence is not yet satisfactory and gap training is required to develop competency. So which rule of evidence are you applying? Having a look at the sheet again. Validity, no, that's all about, making sure that it's a relevant piece or whether it meets the requirements. Authentic, this isn't about whether it's Susan's own work or not. It is authentic. We're having a competency conversation with Susan. This is Susan's evidence. Sufficiency, this isn't, I guess there's some argument about sufficient evidence, but really the crux of it is currency. It is the piece of evidence is current in terms of industry practice. We don't use overhead projectors anymore. We use laptops, we use data projectors. Some schools are blessed to have smart whiteboards. So if a trainer in the vet sector came in with an overhead transparency, they're not going to find that any learning facility is going to have an overhead projector to screen it from, and she's going to be a bit lost. So she's not going to be effective. She's not going to be a competitive trainer and provide good quality training in the vet sector because she's just 15 years in the past and she hasn't maintained that professional development. So the answer to that one would be, the rule of evidence would be that she's not current. So I hope that helps show you some scenarios of how you would be applying these very real situations when you're looking at principles of assessment and rules of evidence.